October Free Press Book Club meeting for What's Not Mine. Oh, I can't do it. I'm blurred. What's Not Mine by Nora Decter. My name's Erin Lebar. I'm your book club administrator. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, I just want to do a quick land acknowledgement. The Free Press and McNally Robinson are both located on Treaty 1 territory. It is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I would like to introduce our hosts and our guest author tonight. So first I'll start with my colleague Jen Zoratti, columnist at the Free Press. We have Chris Hall from McNally Robinson, and of course our author Nora Decter. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're super thrilled to have you. Our meeting will go as it usually does. I'm going to throw to Chris in a second to do an introduction, and then Nora will do a reading, and then Jen will kick it off with the Q&A. If you do have questions, you can throw them in the live chat box. I will be keeping an eye on that as we go, so don't hesitate to get in there and chat with other people. And with that, I will throw to Chris, and we'll get things started.
Great. Thank you, Erin. Hello, everybody. Tonight, we're here to talk about the story of Bria, the main character in Nora Decter's novel, What's Not Mine. Bria is 16. Her father is in trouble with the law, as well as his business associates. Her mother has gone missing. Bria is facing big city problems in the small town of Beauchamp, where she lives with her Aunt Tash and cousins. She's craving something, searching for something in some boy, her sort of boyfriend, she later calls by his real name, Brian. Searching for it in the pills she finds in her father's stash. She seeks escape, even with the bear she encounters in the dumpster, which she wishes had looked at her a little longer with its animal eyes, nodded its head to invite her to follow it out of town. I found this a stressful novel to read, hoping for more hope for Bria, but not finding a lot. What came through most clearly is just how vulnerable she is to the whims of a messed up world, and how her teenage independence isn't enough on its own. Before I turn things over to Jen to lead tonight's conversation, I will ask Nora Decter to read from What's Not Mine.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's always such a pleasure to hear other people describe your book, and I really liked that one. Thank you. And just thanks for having me to the Free Press Book Club and McNally. It's a Manitoba book, and I'm a Manitoba writer, and it is so special to be supported at home and to be read by people sort of from where I'm from and where the books are set. So I toyed with reading a different passage, but I think I'm just going to be kind of boring and read the beginning of the book. We get an intro to like the voice of the novel, and also Bria, and also her boyfriend or pseudo boyfriend, some boy, and I think also importantly to place. So I'm just going to read from the start. It's well past midnight when who should text me but the mystery dick pic man who's been burning up my phone with his unsolicited appendage for the last couple months. The text comes in, announcing itself with a ding, as I pull on my shorts and get ready to leave some boy's apartment. Townhouse, some boy would say, if he could hear me think that. A dick pic, just for me, yippee. Tonight's effort is a strange head-on shot, like up the barrel of a gun. Judging by the state of the floors, this clandestine photo shoot was staged in a gas station bathroom, though it seems carefully cropped to highlight the matter at hand. For months now, almost as long as I've been seeing some boy, I've been getting these texts. Dick pics sent from an unknown number, probably someone left over from last year when I was messing around on apps. I know for a fact it's not some boy because I got one while I was with him, proving his innocence. We were at the bar and neither his dick nor his phone was out at the time. But even before that, I knew. They weren't his style. Too covert. The texts some boy sends me are direct, punctuationless. Come over, come out tonight, when are you off work? Another ding, another dick pic. I try to black out my screen before he can see, but my fingers aren't fast enough. What's that? A rare question mark from him. He takes the phone from my hand, and for a second it's like we're friends, and he's grabbing it to pour over like Steph would, marveling at the mating rituals of our species. But he's not my friend. Neither was Steph. What a creep, he says, tossing my phone onto the bed. That's the consensus, I reply, and it makes me feel good to do so. Say what I want to, even when he disapproves. The insolence. He gets out of bed, gets his jeans from the floor, and puts them back on. I'll walk you home, he says. Well, this is a twist. And startled by the turn, I bow to his whim. Never have we ever walked anywhere except out of the bar, back to his place, into his room. The lights are all off in the kitchen and the front hall, the roommates upstairs in their beds. We go out onto the street. It's quiet but for crickets and the forever wail of trucks on the big highway that butts up against the edge of town a few blocks from here. Let's go, he says. I lead us to the end of his block and turn up Fifth before offering, casual as can be, that was just some rando who texts me dick pics sometimes. I don't even know who it is. He gives me a look. Bria, he says, you could get 50,000 dick pics a day and I wouldn't care. All right then. The air around us is body temp, inside, outside, day or night. The heat's been steady for weeks, and despite just leaving some boy's overly air-conditioned abode, I start sweating. So where is this place? He asks briskly. It's like a 15-minute walk, I answer, lying a little, not wanting him to know how far I go to get to him. He knows I live with my aunt and cousins, knows it's a relatively new thing, but even that strikes too juvenile a note to mention, or too juvenile a note to touch on more than briefly, so we don't. Don't do details, don't do plans, just follow the pattern we've been making for months. You don't have to take me the whole way, I add. I know, he says, words tinged with something. I don't get a chance to figure it out, though, because then he stops abruptly, having walked right into a tangle of silken caterpillar threads dangling from the tree above us. He recoils, swearing, and tries to shake them off, genuinely grossed out. They are disgusting, especially if you didn't grow up dealing with them. Let me, I say, swiping at the air to catch the strings that are invisible in the dark. One of our many plagues in Beauchamp, the caterpillars are especially bad this year, eating the branches bare and shitting all over our cars before dropping their fat brown worm bodies down on silk threads to lay their eggs. When we get home, we take pleasure, my cousin Ainsley and I, in picking them off our clothes, out of our hair, and feeding them to the cats. Worse is when they get stuck to my lip gloss at night. It's harder to dodge them in the dark. I free some boy, and he pats his body over, checking for worms. They're tricky. You want to get them off of you to avoid the shock of disgust a couple hours later when one crawls, somehow hairy and yet also clammy and cool, onto the skin at the back of your neck. But you also don't want to search so hard you crush their fragile bodies into your clothes, hence the gentle pat procedure. Wait, I say, pulling him into the relative illumination of a streetlight. He has a worm on his shoulder, inching its way up towards his collar. I pluck it off and fling it away. Thanks, he says. And with the same look of resentful determination he wore when he insisted on walking me home, he takes my hand. Yikes. That's the feeling in my stomach when he holds my hand. Yikes.
Thank you so much for I always love hearing authors read their own prose. This one especially because I think Bria she has such a fully formed voice right away, like right off the page, you know who she is. So I want to start there, Nora, and just talk to me about kind of coming up with Bria's voice and if it came to you right away or kind of what that process was like in writing her.
For sure. I think I need to have a sense of voice before it feels like a project really takes off. And until then, it's just sort of like throat clearing. And it took me a while to get Bria. My first book was also told from the perspective of a narrator of a similar age, though it was published as YA. That's how far we go and how fast. And I wanted to, we have intentions about what we're going to do with our writing and I suppose our lives, and then things go the way they go. And I thought, my intention was to write something that showed my range with my second book and that was different. So I started off writing about addiction in a small town in Manitoba from the perspective of like a third person narrator and a male main character who was like a version of some boy. Yeah. And then I've always slightly side-eyed authors who talk about like a character arriving, but at a certain point, Bria kind of arrived on the page, and some of the lines that are still in like the first couple of chapters just like came to me. I didn't necessarily know who was saying them yet, but I was intrigued. And then, I wrote towards that, trying to understand who this was.
Yeah. And I think you get that sense too when you're reading it. You want to know her more and you want to get to know her more. Because I just love how acerbic and how funny she is. But she still has that, she can in the same breath be like, yes, I have an amazing body, but also I'm riddled with insecurity. She's like it's such a perfect like teenage experience. The opening too, I think was a great choice to read because I think you do capture that sense of place. I mean, oh my God, anyone who's lived here knows that caterpillar feeling. But I wanted to ask you about the dick pic opening specifically because that is a bold choice, girl. So talk to me a little bit about that and where that came from.
Yeah, it wasn't the original opening, even like very far into the writing process. I don't often like take requests, but I was working with a mentor who was like, I don't think the beginning that you have is the beginning, and I think you should open with a dick pic. And I was like, okay, I trust you. I will go off and try and write this. Um, yeah, I think it's like I'm so appreciative to hear that you have affection for Bria. I have loads of affection for Bria, but sometimes putting like a complicated female narrator out into the world, the internet has opinions. And yeah, I think narrators like Bria who are unabashed and like a little, you said acerbic and flawed. Really, when we talk about unlikableness, I think we're talking about flaws in characters. They are met with a lot of criticism. Yeah, so I mean, I guess I like writing that feels a little dangerous, right? That it's
Yeah.
like not for everyone. And I have to say that like Bria slightly shocks and appalls even me, with the things that she says and does. So readers aren't alone in that. But yeah, I hope that that sort of stressful experience of living life through her eyes is countered by like some of her strength and some of the like subtle resilience and hope that is threaded into the novel too. But yeah, it wasn't the first opening. And yeah, like I said, I don't usually like when people tell me what to write, but a mentor that I really trust suggested it. And I went off and tried to write it, and it made it into the final book.
Did she also suggest you follow it up immediately with the ickiness of insects?
No, but perhaps
I was
uh
struck by that when you were reading.
fitting. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, the myriad ways our skin can crawl, right?
Mhm.
This is a reader question, but it hooks into what we're talking about. And the reader wants to know how you determined Bria's age.
Yeah, that's tricky for me. Like I said, I wanted to write the narrator in my first book is like 6 months older than Bria, like I returned to the same sort of stage in life. But I think I like a teenage narrator who is somewhat like trapped, like you're not about to graduate high school and have that freedom to start making decisions about your life. You are still subject to the whims of the adults who are in charge of you. And I find that compelling.
Yeah, no, me too. And I think that was something that I noticed right away was like just the age that she is. It's just such a cusp thing. And this was a question I was going to ask you later in the conversation, but I'm going to ask it now. Um, just with the cover art, some of the metaphors that come in, the abandoned water slides thing, I think is so evocative of so many things. So it's like that trick mirror of nostalgia, like it's never as good when you return, or like the end of childhood, the end of innocence, Bria's own abandonment. There's so many things. And then the final line in the book, of course, returns to that go girl idea where you have to kind of take the plunge and jump down the slide, right? So I wanted to ask you about that and just where that image came from and how much it kind of influenced your writing.
Well, I love that idea that the Go Girls of the Water Slide connect to the book ending on the word go. I had never put that together, so thank you. Um, I find Manitoba to be endlessly inspiring. I grew up here, was born here in Brandon, grew up here, left for like my 20s. Not because I ever lost that feeling of like being compelled by Manitoba, but because kind of like the characters in my books, I felt the need to like distance myself a bit from a challenging like childhood. and then came back. And almost everything I've ever written was set here. And I think I'm really into like YouTube videos of like abandoned prairie towns. And there's very often like, it's not like whole abandoned towns. It's like, you know, one fall down edifice in a town that like died when the train stopped stopping there. And I think especially abandoned vacation locales have like a real vibe. So I was working on this and really like conjuring that teenage aimlessness that one has in the summer. And I somehow came across a YouTube video. It's like, you know, there's like those people who explore abandoned places. And this one in particular was a person exploring the Wet and Wild, like Skinner's Wet and Wild water slides in Lockport before it was torn down. And yeah, I just found it like, I guess I find that, as I said, like that teenage space of like having some freedom and independence, but still being under the rule of your parents to be really interesting and compelling. And the spaces that teenagers claim as their own also kind of fascinate me. And it was pointed out to me when the book came out, like Skinner's Wet and Wild was torn down in the writing of the book, but then like Fun Mountain closed.
Yeah.
And there's already like similar footage of like the graffiti and the people like having, you know, like bonfires there and stuff. So it really feels like it's kind of like almost an endless cycle. And then one more thing, I think it speaks to like there's so much going on in Manitoba. There's so many people, there's like, you know, rich national parks and places to go. But then there's also like maybe not enough money and people to support necessarily like two water parks in this economy. So like that the nature of a place like that where we like not everything is going to take off also really fascinates me.
Yeah, totally. And I think with the spaces teenagers claim too, I think this has been a really common conversation topic like throughout the pandemic too, is sort of this loss of third places, especially for teenagers. If you're not legal, I know Bria kind of carves out her own by going to her dad's friend's bar because he can kind of keep an eye on her, but that's not really a space for teenagers. She just kind of has to find these places on her own, or like the pool at the apartment complex, or places like this that are just sort of, you have to kind of find your own space to hang out because the world kind of is like, we don't want you here. We don't want you here. We don't want you here. So I thought that was really interesting too. Speaking of place, it felt very summer to 2021 to me, because that summer really stands out to me. Like the sky is always orange. It smells like smoke. The bug play, like the caterpillars, all of that. Talk to me about some of this dystopian stuff that we're dealing with climate and how that influenced place, because I haven't really seen that yet in Manitoba set novels. And I was really interested in it.
You're spot on about that timeline. I was probably working on like the first like real complete draft
Yeah.
in summer 2021. Yeah, so those details were super vivid. Like, yeah, the sky being a weird apocalyptic color and seemingly like plague after plague of insects. Yeah, so that was easy inspiration to reach for. The first book that I wrote is set in a winter in Manitoba, so perhaps I was also just like, we got summers too, and they're extreme as well. Uh, uh, and yeah, I just think that like it's almost a cliche to have the weather be a character in a novel. However, I think if anyone gets to do it, it should be Manitoba authors because our weather is it has lots of personality, you know?
Agreed. Chris, do you have any questions? I feel like I'm monopolizing the conversation, but if you
That's great. I'm just listening. But I do. I kind of mentioned it in the intro that I found it a stressful read. I found it difficult in some ways. I had to kind of almost put it down and breathe again because and I just wondered what writing it was like. Was it hard to write because she's such a vulnerable teenager?
I think that the ways that I can relate to Bria is really different than I am, although like I have little nuggets of things that we've both experienced. I always say like I'm not a Bria. I'm more of an Ains with Bria tendencies. Um, I like the idea of urgency in a book, especially a book about teenagers, like how like 2 months in the life of a teenager can feel like completely transformative. I think that full disclosure, I'm 38, almost 39, and I think that I had just enough distance from that time in my life where I was drawing from like personal experience with Bria and being, like I was saying, still sort of subject to the whims of the adults in her life, having some independence and almost being like controlled, but being controlled, but also being under supervised at the same time. Yeah, so I didn't find it too hard, but that is something that I'm conscious of. There's been like addiction has impacted my life and my family's life. There's been deaths from fentanyl in my family, and that did make it harder. But like I said, I think that I was writing about 15, 16-year-old Bria, and I felt like grown up 30 something year old Nora had enough distance in order for it to be like I can dip my toes into writing every day and sort of match that sense of urgency that's on the page without it stressing me out too much. I get stressed out about other things, but I knew that Bria was going to be okay. And if people
That's an advantage you had. The urgency is exactly right. I think that's exactly what it was. Why I had to put it down was just to slow it down. But yeah, there's an intensity to that summer she's experiencing, but she's not exactly safe. Like it did smack, like it's a long time since I grew up in a small town, long before fentanyl, but there were kids that just didn't luck out on having great parents or great support systems, and that felt very real.
Yeah, one thing I relate to with Bria is like being sort of saved by your extended family, and like it just takes like one aunt or like a friend of the family to take an interest and make you feel like things are going to be okay. So I think knowing that she had Ains and Tash and Dave looking out for her also made me feel better about how she was doing. But like I said, there's parts of the book I don't like, and that like you're not supposed to say this or do this, but like that in reviewing them, my eyes would almost skim over certain paragraphs. So I'm like, that's horrible, and I don't need to read it every day.
With the obviously addiction is a centerpiece in the book. And I wanted to know a little bit more about that and why you wanted to write a book that dealt with addiction, particularly the way it's dealt with. I thought it was really so well done in that Bria's addiction is so subtle in that you don't really necessarily notice it until you really notice it, right? Like it's just, and the whole like the bargaining with herself, I'll do better tomorrow. The whole like it just was this very gradual slide until suddenly it felt like an emergency. So I just wanted to know more about that and why you wanted to write it and also that way.
I'm glad it comes across as subtle, because she's not necessarily subtle as like a person.
No.
So I found myself drawn to fentanyl as I was like sort of editing my first book and trying to get a second book off the ground. Um, as I was saying, like addiction and opiate addiction existed in my family when I was growing up. It was something that I was aware of from the time I was a little kid. And then when I started to hear in the news about fentanyl, it just seemed um, like a hyperbolic worsening of an already incredibly terrible situation. Um, so yeah, so I was just drawn to it. And like I was saying earlier, it really shifted. Like at first I thought that I wanted to write about a person in recovery. I thought that I wanted to write about like a 30-something-year-old man who'd done some questionable things in his addiction and was trying to move on. And instead I became drawn to like the stage that Bria is at, which is like it just taking hold of her. So in like the research I did for the novel, there's so many stories about this is from like, maybe like more early aughts when OxyContin and Percocets were being prescribed like really readily, especially in the States by doctors. Like there's so many stories about, the star football player or swimmer who like gets an injury and then gets a prescription, and then all of a sudden their parents and they are finding out that they are addicted to like these really strong opiates. And as you were saying, like what really fascinated me about Bria that I wanted to explore on the page was all of that lying to yourself and the sort of like two levels of her consciousness that are going on, where on one level, to like get through her day to day, she is like in denial about what's going on at the same time as her dependence on the drug is growing. So I was really interested in like where she starts to admit to herself that things are getting out of her control, and then what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really amazing too, just to see, because she doesn't, like, yes, she's flawed, and yes, I can see, and I certainly, like, I'm also 39, so I'm far enough away from being 16 that I could be like, you kind of want to grab her by the shoulders and shake her sometimes. But also the amount of care that she always had for Emily and Doug was very interesting, because it's like she didn't have that kind of parenting. So I think you kind of see the parentified kid come out in her, where she has this sort of like really high key sense of responsibility for these two little kids. But then when she's not with them, she's kind of allowed to be a child again herself. So I thought that was really interesting too.
Yeah, I like that contrast between like the different roles that she plays in her own life. And it's always so much easier to be sensible and responsible and show care, like not towards yourself, um, but towards other people. And I think Emily and Doug, so her like much younger cousins that she is babysitting for the summer, it's like they soften her, but I think it's another extended family thing that is going to like hopefully save her too, right? Um, like the feeling of like not wanting to let them down, of wanting to be there for them, etc.
Drugs obviously aren't the only existential threat in this book. I think we need to talk about the men in this book, and sort of the specter of misogyny that exists that she lives under. So yeah, let's talk about the boys. Let's talk about some boys specifically. So there's a reader that wanted to know just about sort of that shift that she's kind of refers to him as some boy and then starts using his name. So yeah, they want to know the significance of that.
That was a thing. So when I'm writing a first draft, some things just kind of appear on the page. And those first couple of like lines of dialogue of Bria's that came to me also came along with her calling this guy some boy. And like I said, he was initially like the main character, the protagonist. And I found him, I was writing about him and like him spending time with this much younger character named Bria. And I felt that he was going to be gross towards her. And I was like, no, leave her alone. Um, and then it, dawned on me like, he would cross the line with her. And then I, flipped protagonist, etc. The way I came to understand the name is that I think it's another way of like distancing herself from what's going on. She is telling herself, like many young people do, that everything is cool, that she's got this under control, that she is like smarter and wiser than people who might be telling her what to do. And so the nickname for him, he's just like any old boy. He's some boy. He's just somebody to her. And then when it becomes all too real, he finds out that she's a minor, right? That she's 15, 16. He's been sort of like purposefully or studiously not asking her how old she is. He finds that out, and he finds out too that she has this somewhat unlimited access to these pills, these like fentanyl pills. And yeah, I just felt like at that moment it becomes real to her. It's no longer like a game, but something where she's in too deep and she doesn't really know how to get out or if she wants to get out.
Yeah, that was my sense of it too. And then obviously we learn who is sending the dick pics. And that is such a devastating moment in this book. And I think even if you see it, even if you figure out who it might be, like it's such a, it's such a complicated thing, because she when she hesitates on telling anyone, or when she, like when she is keeping them too. Like I think she on some level is like, oh, I maybe deserve this, So talk to me about that piece of it, and just yeah, like these adults in her life are just, yeah.
Yeah, that was another thing that just kind of came out from the ether. And I was like, I'm writing about dick pics. This is a new development. I think that so um yeah, I think Bria is an example of the kind of girl who is sometimes targeted, right? She is, like, for lack of a better term, a little fast, or like presents that way, right? One thing that I wanted to do is like something that drives a bit of a wedge between her and her cousin Ainsley, who's like her best friend and cousin wrapped into one, is that Bria has this sort of brief dalliance with Cole, Ainsley's crush, and you think it's going to be like something more salacious, but all they did was kiss, and that's enough of a betrayal. Like that's more than enough of a betrayal for her closeness with Ains. But yeah, she's the kind of person who people would just assume that she went all the way, right? And I think too, I wanted to get at this idea that like a girl like Bria who's sort of under supervised and vulnerable, it's going to be like guys like Samboy who are targeting her. And then also she thinks at first, so in that passage that I read, she assumes that Dick Pic Man is somebody who's left over when she was fooling around on apps, just kind of messaging people for a lark. And instead, it's somebody who's like in the home with her. And that is a blow. And knowing that these two people, Ainsley and her Aunt Tash, she who actually care about her and who really know her, not like her reputation, that they might not believe her if she told them, is like kind of the most devastating part of the book.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What
no, it was.
it does too, sorry, Jen, what
Oh,
it
go
does
ahead.
too is you've both commented that you're old enough to look back on your high school age, but so is Tash. Like she's your age-ish, let's say. And yet this guy is in her life too. So like it's hard to escape then.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to Nora's point too, like, I think that's what made it so terrifying, is that it's literally like the call is coming from inside the house, like, it's just like, I can't believe like this person has been around, like, and would he do that to Ains? I don't know. Right. Like, so it's interesting how sort of those cycles and patterns can repeat.
It's a good thing you had Cole in the book because he's a decent guy, isn't he?
Yes, I needed a few not evil men in there for the hope factor.
Oh God.
But that I wanted to kind of pick up on that as well, and just talking about the women in the book. And it was very striking to me how they all kind of dealing with the things that Bria's dealing with, but on different levels, right? So, like, you have Tash dealing with having to take care of her niece, dealing with like these kinds of like peripherally, right? And then you have, they're all dealing with these situations together, but they all kind of move through the world in different ways. So I want to talk a little bit about Ains, because I had a lot of fondness for her too. And I feel like, yeah, it's hard when you're like, you're feeling a certain way about yourself, even though you're so talented and you're so driven, but then like you're like hot cousin who like made out with the guy you like comes along, like that also felt so true to me in a way that made me wince in recognition. And it's just like, oh, you poor girl. So yeah, tell me a little bit about some of the other characters and how you came up with them.
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to explore was like having family members who are addicts or who are, suffering from addiction. So Bria's dad and her mom are both addicts. Her mom, especially, her dad's more sort of like a drug user who also traffics. And so in the background, or like in the history of Tash, is her really trying to save both of them, and then distancing herself from them, for her own well-being and peace of mind and survival. So like the weight of that, to walk away from somebody who, you love so much and you just want them to do okay. And yeah, and then Ainsley, I was really interested in like young female friendship. Um, and I hope that the title of the book has like multiple interpretations, but one of the ones that I thought a lot about was like this sort of like self-centered, um, really extreme form of like female friendship where you almost see yourself as like one entity. Or I think maybe Bria sees her and Ainsley as like being sort of like one person almost, or like everything of Ains is also Bria's for the taking. I have described Bria as the kind of person who sees something that she wants and says, can I have that? And then Ains is like the total opposite of that. So like, yeah, what's not mine, she is literally sleeping next to Ains at night in her bed, and yet there are things about Ains that are a total mystery, and like vice versa. um yeah, so I think with Tash and Ainsley and Bria, I wanted like three women who are like really close and know each other really well, but also have these huge like blind spots about how much they can actually be there for each other. And the stage of life that Bria and Ainsley are at is when I think sometimes with female friendship, it can feel almost like a betrayal just to be evolving and maturing in your own kind of direction. And I think that's a bit what Bria is going through with Ainsley, and like the parts of Ainsley that are unknown to Bria.
Yeah, the scene that really took me back to being 16 specifically, and I think you feel this more than even in your senior year of high school, when friends start making plans and those plans don't necessarily include you. So like when a friend casually, oh, I might move away. Oh, I might go to this university. Oh, I'm thinking about getting this. And you sort of have that panic of like, oh God, there's no space for me in this friendship anymore, or they're going to leave me or something's gonna, and I really recognize that when Bria's having that, when Ains is showing her apartment. I'm just doing research. But to Bria, it's like, oh, like this is what is going to happen. Like it's so scary. And I think that's so just so real of being that age.
Yeah, I find myself really drawn to writing teenagers because of those moments where it just feels so enormous, right? Like your first major realization about life couldn't
Totally.
feel any more significant.
Yeah. And you're the first person to feel the feeling, right? Like that's also really intense as well, right? And I think Bria has that as well often, where it's like, oh my God, like, why didn't anyone tell me about this feeling that I'm having? Um, does anyone else, I'm conscious of time. Like, does anyone else have any other questions? Because I can keep asking them.
I was wondering, or at one point wondered if there was a question mark at the end of the title, because what is such a common beginning of a question? And then I was thinking about what would that change? What's not mine, question mark. But somebody had asked us if it had anything to do with a quote from Shakespeare from Measure for Measure. Was it what's mine is yours, what yours is mine? But you credit a songwriter in your acknowledgments. Do you want to
Yeah.
tell us about that source?
I love that Shakespearean connection. I think that's so magical when you're like influenced by something, but maybe don't even know. Yeah, so it's the title of a song by Welsh musician Kate LeBon, who I find very inspiring. And you don't always get to choose the title of one's book, but I named it this and was kind of just waiting for someone at my publisher to be like, there's probably a better title. They never said that. I am perhaps too much of a fan of ambiguity and things like being able to be read in more than one way. So I love the idea of adding a question mark and how that would change the interpretation. Um, yeah, I think it's about like young people, well, many different interpretations, but one of the ones for Bria is like thinking about what she's inheriting from her parents and how much choice she has involved. Yeah. So the sort of intergenerational aspect of addiction and what she's going to do about that.
Such a good question for a teenager though too, because you're kind of finding out like this. There's this great big world, and maybe you, I mean, I'm just thinking on the fly, but as you grow up into it, you just get to make such vast assumptions when you're 10 about
Mhm.
the world is just my oyster, and then you start getting into your teens, and you gotta. It's not all for me. It's
Yeah. I also find the like youthful realization of like how wrong you can be about things to be very interesting too. Be like so freaking sure about like, you know, some relationship or some life choice and then be like so staggeringly wrong about it. Yeah, I kind of like playing in that space too.
Yeah. And the, oh my God, my parents are people realization as well when you're a teenager.
I had
that
a
that hits home
question.
because I have two teenage daughters, so I was partly reading this through my teenage daughters. So
Oh.
for that, Jen.
No, no wonder you were stressed out reading
Exactly.
I had a question about the very end of the book as we see Bria going to rehab. And like Jen, and like I'm sure a lot of readers, I was just so rooting for her this whole time. I was so endeared towards her. And then the book ended, and you don't really know if she succeeded in that rehabilitation process or if she went back to her ways or what happened to her. And I just found myself really wanting to know that she was going to be okay. And I was curious if there was any desire from your standpoint to revisit that character and write a sequel to this book.
It's not something that is like top of mind. I think I might like the idea a little more of like a book in the same universe with
Mm-hmm.
some of the same characters or maybe the same town. Um, yeah, I have like a close friend who was like, "Do you ever imagine like what they're doing now?" And I'm like, I don't really. Like I think that I have some like for everyone who's worried about Bria in my mind and in my heart, she takes to rehab and really like turns her life around. I think the whole of the book was geared at like it's I mean, many people struggle with addiction for many years. It often takes more than one go at treatment before it works, before it takes. But I think that like things are just so dire in Bria's situation that it's like a seize the day kind of moment. And luckily, she does have an aunt who's a social worker, a family friend who's been through treatment, and I think that they are looking out for her. I think with the like thinking about inheritance and intergenerational addiction and trauma, I think that she doesn't want to turn out like her parents. So it's like one of the things I was most interested in writing with addiction was like how can you be like Bria and see the devastation that her mother's addiction has wrought. She's sort of like numb to that, like she's almost said goodbye to her mom, which is like a distancing that might help in the short term, but is still like a huge wound. Yeah, so I think I would like to think, and I'd like to tell readers that she's okay, that like that treatment helps. Obviously, like life is still going to be long and hard, and there's still going to be pain, and she's still going to have to deal with her like dysfunctional dad and all of that stuff. Um, but I think that uh, she's smart enough that I hope that that treatment would have gotten through to her. I wanted her to be, you know, I relate to her in some ways, but in a lot of ways, she's like almost an ode to like some of the girls that I've known in over time who were like I was almost like a little scared of, but like really wanted to be friends with because they were so cool and like outspoken and witty. And I think that like I hope that her intelligence would have like latched on to some of the lessons that she was being taught about how she doesn't have to be trapped in this pattern or in this cycle of addiction.
Um, are you working on anything right now?
I am. So I am currently the writer in residence at the Winnipeg Public Library, which has been very exciting and comes with the all too rare page time to write. So I'm writing somewhat full time right now, as well as working with different Manitoba writers. If there's anyone out there who's interested, you can Google Winnipeg Public Library writer in residence, and there's the info on submitting. Um, my current project is still like in the flux stage where I could tell you what it's about, and that might not be true in a couple of months. But a couple sort of details. I was inspired by, there's a quiz online called the Difficult Person Test or Quiz. If you Google that, it'll come up. And it's basically like a personality quiz that evaluates how difficult you are to get along with. And I was inspired by that to write about just a family of difficult people dealing with each other. I'm thinking about how we isolate ourselves online and in real life. And then also, and this is like not groundbreaking, but I think also very like fertile earth to mine from, like the stories that we tell in families and how they change like over a lifetime. So yeah, some difficult people in my next book.
Well, can't wait.
I think that's probably a good place to call it. Man, this was such a great discussion. I always love when these chats help me like find a whole new appreciation for the book. So thank you, Jen and Chris, for your super thoughtful questions, and Nora, of course, for sharing so much about your writing process. We really appreciate that. Next month's book is called Pinching Zwieback. Zwieback, is that right, Chris? I don't know how to pronounce it.
Not sure how to pronounce it. I've just read it.
Okay, by Mitch Taves. It's a collection of short stories that are all kind of within the same universe. Longtime book club members know that I love a short story, so I'm really excited to dig into that next month. And I just popped a link in the chat for our book club survey. So if you have any feedback about our meeting format, our book choices, anything else you want to share with us, now's the time to do it. It's open until October 31st, which is Thursday. So please, if you have feedback, let us know your thoughts. And that is it for us tonight. So thank you so much again, Nora, Jen, Chris. Thank you everyone for watching, and we will see you next month. Bye, everybody.
Everybody.